So all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it, and the bill moves forward under Rule 40.
Under Rule 40.
Yeah. All right. And then we also have Senate Study Bill 1053. Senator Evans, you are in order. Do you have a subcommittee report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do. Myself, Senator Cranbrink, and Senator Kornbach met in subcommittee. Myself and Senator Cranbrink voted in favor of advancing the bill.
Thank you. Senator Evans, you're in order for opening comments.
Okay, so the bill does two main things. Sets the regular and categorical state percent of growth for fiscal year 2026 at 2%. Continues the property tax replacement payments associated with increasing SSA. The Peter P, as this is referred to, uses state aid to help pay for the additional levy, acting as a temporary freeze on the additional levy. And that concludes my opening comments.
Is there discussion on the bill? Senator Kornbach, you're in order.
Thank you. 2% is entirely inadequate to meet the needs of our local school districts, our public schools throughout the state. In fact, this year, the governor is proposing 2%. That's the number in this bill. Inflation is running at 3%. So we're falling further and further behind inflation. That's consistent with the record over the last 8 years. And I would refer you to the handout that I passed around to everybody on the committee earlier before the meeting. If you look at the first graph in the handout, this tracks the state cost per pupil with the categoricals. Those are the two main things that are affected by the percent of growth, which is what this bill is all about. The lower line here gives the actual path of the state cost per pupil plus categoricals. The upper line shows what that state cost per pupil and categoricals would have been had we simply followed inflation, had we simply increased those categories at the rate of the consumer price index. What you can see is that the gap has grown bigger and bigger and bigger over the last 8 years. This year alone, regular program students are $822 behind where we were 8 years ago in purchasing power terms. Now, I know what Republicans have said, we put more money into schools every year. Yeah, a little bit, but not enough to keep up with the cost of providing services. Let me give you a household example. Let's suppose you go in for your annual review and your boss says, well, you've done okay this year, I'm going to give you a $1,000 raise. That sounds fine until you go home and you look at your bills and your family's bills have gone up $3,000. A $1,000 raise doesn't cover that. How do you balance your budget? You have to cut $2,000. Yes, you have more dollars to spend, but they don't go as far. School superintendents and school boards have faced exactly the same problem, except with a whole bunch more zeros at the end of the problem. They have gotten a little bit more, but it hasn't kept up with the cost of providing services, of heating the buildings, of putting gas in the bus, and most particularly of keeping salaries up to inflation so that they can remain competitive. Moving on to the next page, we spent a lot of time last year talking about the area education agencies and the special ed kids. Well, special ed kids get a multiple of the state cost per pupil, and this graph tracks how far short they have been. When regular program students fall short, special ed kids fall short by a multiple of that. So the top line in the graph is the regular program students, and the lower lines go down level 1, level 2, all the way down to level 3. The neediest kids this year alone are being shortchanged $3,235 relative to where they were 8 years ago. The next page tracks overall school spending from the state. The gap here this year alone, $440 million, not quite $500 million short of keeping up with purchasing power. Now, the rest of the handout has to do with higher ed. The story is largely the same, but that's not the subject for today. So let me move on. But I will note that in order to have kept up with inflation, schools would have needed an additional 9% this year alone in the state cost per pupil, an additional 9% alone to keep up. To meet the inflation next year, with current year inflation running at about 3%, we're talking 12% is what we would have needed in order to just maintain the purchasing power and our investment in our kids. We're not going to get 12%, but we sure as heck need to do a lot better than 2%. 2% means we'd fall further behind. Now, indeed, for some schools, this minimal amount means that they won't even get as much money next year as they have this year. Okay, they're actually going to get a budget cut. The good news for them is that they can go to they can come to the state board and ask for to be approved for the budget guarantee. And if that goes through, the good news is they can get that cut restored and plus 1% growth. Not 2%, but 1%. The bad news is that make-up money comes from local property tax. It does not come from state aid. The majority party this year has indicated a high priority in cutting property taxes. If you pass an allowable growth, if you pass a state percent of increase at 2%, you will instead be increasing property taxes. At 2%, it's 159 school districts. Almost half, just short of half of the school districts in the state will have to ask their property taxpayers for more money next year. Now, if we were instead to pass a 5% allowable growth, that number would be cut by 2/3. We would be down to not 159, we would be down to only 57. And if we would go to 6%, we would eliminate 80% of the schools on budget guarantee. We would be down to only 32. If you're really serious about cutting property taxes this year, more state aid to help out our schools will help not only the kids in their education, but it will help all local property taxpayers as well. Finally, there is the contrast that's very disturbing with the voucher program. The voucher program, next school year, the income caps will be removed. That means that every student going to a private school will get voucher support. That means with the cap removed, the students that you will be adding next year are the students from families who are making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 a year income, who don't need the voucher support to afford private school for their kids. The cost of adding just those high income families is just shy of $100 million for maybe 2% of the school students in Iowa. 2% get an extra $100 million. The increase for public schools under a 2% proposal here and with the proposed AEA cuts would also be about $100 million. That's $100 million for the 2% of high-income wealthy and only $100 million for the 92% who go to the public schools. That's not a contrast I think you want to take home to explain to your constituents at your public forums. So for all of these reasons, I'm certainly a no on this bill today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Is there further discussion? Senator Donahue?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, again, will keep this short because I'll have much more to say later on. But I just want to reiterate the fact that over half the school districts will end up on budget guarantee. And that is something that used to hurt just the rural areas. And I shouldn't say just, because that is important that we save those rural schools. That is something that has always put them in a terrible spot. But now we're looking at the big urban centers that have been able to kind of absorb some of these cuts. They are no longer able to. They are now going to be on budget guarantee. West Des Moines, I believe, is one of those. That is a huge number of people who go to school there. And because of this, they will not have enough funding. The other thing I just want to kind of bring us back to, he gave you a lot of different numbers, and I'm just going to stick to where we are right now at 2%, which is around 105 million, right? And yes, a big chunk of the budget for this state is going to public schools. We understand that, but new monies aren't covering the inflation rate, which, as he said, hurts the purchasing power. If we were just to be at 5%, we would be almost equal in dollars, around $311 million new dollars to the public schools. Not only would it take schools off of the budget guarantee, but it would keep us equal with the new monies you are giving to the private schools at about $314. So 5% would just kind of help let the public schools compete, as the governor said yesterday when she was in Alburnett, just north of my hometown, talking about how public schools need to compete with private schools. We can't compete if we don't have the funding that we need to at least meet inflation and increase our purchasing powers. Plain and simply. That's all I have for today.
Thank you, Senator. Are there further comments? Senator Garrett?
Well, I'll have to apologize. I didn't come prepared with a bunch of graphs and so on. But focusing on Governor Reynolds' terms reminds me of what happened when the Democrats were in control. Chet Culver was the governor, and they controlled the legislature, both houses of the legislature. And the thing that I remember the most and that I think is most significant was toward the end of Governor Culver's term, Democrats actually had a situation come up where they passed a budget, and then roughly halfway through the fiscal year, they realized that they didn't have enough money to fund what they had authorized in their budget, and Governor Culver made a 10% across the board cut in the budgeting. That's just 1 year, one fiscal year. They cut everything 10%, including education. So I know Senator Cornbach doesn't want to talk about the situation back in those times, and there were other things that went on as far as budgetary practices. But I'll just stop there. As I said, I didn't bring a lot of charts and so on, but I'll never forget that particular year and the big cuts made in just 1 year. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I think, Senator Winkler, did you? Okay, Senator Winkler.
I just want to there will be more on the floor in regard to this. If you remember that situation, it was called a global recession, and the governor and the legislature were obligated by law, because the revenue had dropped because of the recession, they were obligated by law to cut the budget. And so it is the safeguards that come in with school funding. I will also let you know that school districts kept the spending authority. And so in some cases, they were able to make up the difference with their savings account. Do not use this as an example, please. Unusual circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Kreinbrink?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had spoke during subcommittee. Just want to throw a couple numbers out there as well. First of all, vouchers are illegal. I mean, I would think that Senator Cornbach would know that this is an educational savings account. They're not vouchers. They've actually been tried in court, and vouchers aren't legal. So if we please keep using it as a example, please don't use vouchers as what this program is, because it's not vouchers. Secondly, we have a $9 billion budget. We're spending $4.2 billion of the entire budget on K through 12 schools. So almost 50% of our budget is spent on education between K through 12 schools, both public and private. Public students, all in with local, state, and federal funds, are looking at about close to $18,000 a student that we're paying to educate our public school students. We're at about $7,800 that we give to the educational savings account. So less than half, probably close to a third of the money that we're giving to the private schools, and they're educating their students with a lot less than what the public schools are actually educating their students with. If you want to make things equal, then give the private schools the same money that the public schools are getting, totally, within the state and federal government. So that cuts both ways as well. The other thing I think is important is not to tell that Senator Cornbach doesn't tell the rest of the story. Senator Cornbach, would you yield?
Certainly, sir.
So my question is, if the families, and this is truly happening all across our nation, partly with what happened in the last federal administration, as inflation has happened so rapidly that I think your $1,000 raise is probably not even accurate. It's probably a bigger spread than the $1,000 even.
I was using a simple numerical example, sir, for ease of comprehension.
Could he please shut his off while I'm talking, because we only have one mic on at the same time.
You're asking me to
Could you
yield.
shut it
I'm
off
yielding.
yet?
Senator
shut your
Kreinbrink has the
mic
floor,
off?
Senator. He hasn't asked the question yet.
I'm on my way to asking the question, but I hear feedback now. Could he shut his mic off? Thank you, Senator Cornbach. So if you go and you get a $1,000 raise from your employer, and your expenses have raised $3,000 that year, this is my question, Senator Cornbach. What does that family do?
What they do is what school districts have had to do. They have to cut their budget. They have more dollars, but they don't have enough to keep up with the cost of living. They have to cut their budget. And that's exactly my point. That's exactly what school districts have had to do these last 8 years. Yes, they have gotten a little bit more money out of the state. No, it has not been enough to keep up with expenses. They've had to cut programs in a myriad of different ways. You should ask your local school superintendents. I'm sure they can fill you in.
So if we then tell that employee to go back to their employer and say, I'm going to quit if you don't give me a 5% raise, I mean, if we go back and ask for additional money to the employer and the employer can't afford it, so the employer then has to go out of business because they have to pay their employees more than what the revenue that they have coming in. What we're doing here is we're offering a sustainable, which wasn't sustainable in the past, form of funding for our schools. We feel, and we've talked to the superintendents, we talk to all the same people that you talk to, probably not quite as much to the law, or what am I thinking? probably not as much to the association that you do, but we talk to the decision-making people in the finances within the school systems, the superintendents and the business directors. And the first thing they appreciate is us addressing this early like we are. And the second thing they appreciate is us offering a sustainable amount of growth that we can commit to, and they know that they're going to get it. And so with that, I will be supporting this bill, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Was there a question in there? I thought that was
No, I
already
asked you my first question.
Thank you, Senator. In the interest of time, I'm going to go back to Senator Evans for closing remarks.
Excuse me, I want the floor, please.
You want to speak a second time?
Yes, please.
Can you keep it brief?
I will try.
We're starting to fringe on some subcommittee time that I know a lot of these people need to get to, but.
And full committee.
Quickly, please.
Okay. First of all, when Senator Garrett goes back 15 years, he described some of the difficult decisions that we had to make. He didn't describe the reason that we had to make them, which was that the Republican administration of George W. Bush crashed the national economy. We had the worst recession since the Great Depression. That forced upon every state in the country difficult decisions. We, in fact, did not cut state funding 10% across the board, all right? But we did manage to maintain the spending authority for our schools, and as Senator Winkler pointed out, a lot of schools were able to maintain programs. Some cut back as a cautionary measure, which was prudent, but we recovered from that, and for several years beyond that, we consistently provided a 4% allowable growth. That is our record. The Republican record, since they took over state government 8 years ago, is displayed in the graphic handout that I gave before. It shows consistently whatever level of commitment they think they inherited, they have consistently shaved off and shaved off and shaved off some more, undermining that commitment to our public schools, and this needs to stop. As far as something that is sustainable, the biggest problem about sustainability here is the income tax cuts that you guys have passed that are going to cost the state a loss of $1 billion in state revenue between FY24 and FY26. The problem here is the sustainability problem is much larger than the schools. I'm trying to keep the schools alive, in operation, and providing adequate income. 2% doesn't do it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Evans, you are in order for closing remarks.
Okay, thank you for the feedback, everyone. This bill would provide over $5.7 billion in state and local funding for public K-12 students. Under this bill, categorical funding consists of $747.5 million, which is an increase of $59.3 million from the past fiscal year, for teacher salary supplement, professional development supplement, and early intervention and the teacher leadership compensation program. This bill would provide $136.7 million in property tax replacement payments, which is an increase of $9.9 million as compared to fiscal year 2025. I will save further comments on the interest of time for the floor, and that concludes my closing remarks, and I will move the bill.
Roll call vote has been requested. Mr. Clerk may call the roll.
Senator Evans?
Yes.
Senator Taylor?
Yes.
Senator Cornbach?
No.
So the vote is 11 ayes and 5 noes. The bill carries, and the bill will be moved to the calendar under Rule 40. And I will turn the chair back to Senator Evans.
Thank you, Senator Taylor. Subcommittee assignments will be distributed electronically, and if there is no, yes, Senator Winkler.
Regard to the subcommittees, will we go by calendar, by the time slot on subs, or will we go just in order of how they were scheduled? Do you have any idea? Many of them were education subcommittees today.
Yes, we'll take a look and hopefully put those on next week's education committee. Is that the question? I didn't understand the question, sorry.
The subcommittees that were scheduled today that were kind of over time, how will those be handled? Is it just the progression, or have those where the time has passed been canceled?
Let me confirm. Hang on just a second. Senator Winkler had a question. Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to assume we'll go on progression, but I don't want to commit.
understanding is e-gaming would eventually, it's like bring in certain amounts of gambling that are currently not legal and going to illegal sources from Iowa, bringing more revenue into the state at a time when gambling income has been going down.
I believe I would answer that in saying that as we look at moratorium bills and we look at not expanding more casinos within the state of Iowa, we thought, and I thought, and some of my committee members here thought, that having an e-gaming situation would actually look more upon as an expansion of gambling in the state of Iowa, and we didn't believe that it belonged in this particular bill and thought that it should be of a grander conversation in a separate bill and in a separate situation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other conversation on Amendment 110 to Senate Study Bill 1069? Seeing none, Senator Webster, you're in order for closing comments on the amendment.
I simply move the amendment.
Senator Webster moves the amendment. Senator Weiner, how do you wish to vote on the amendment? Short form has been requested. All those in favor of advancing Amendment 110 to Senate Study Bill 1069 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The amendment is approved. Now we're back on Senate Study Bill 1069 as amended. Are there any conversations amongst the committee on Senate Study Bill 1069 as amended? Senator Kornbach.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. This bill limits free market competition. And speaking as a professional economist with 47 years of experience, I object to that. There are some things that free markets don't do very well, like dealing with environmental pollution. But by and large, free markets do provide good products, and it's driven principally by the incentives of competition. This is especially true when there is entry available into a market. Okay? If you have a restaurant on Main Street in your hometown and they're doing well, another restaurateur comes along, wants to open a second restaurant. They're not prohibited from doing that. Yes, the second restaurant may take some business away from the first, okay? But that gives the first restaurant, actually both restaurants, incentives to improve their product, to improve their menu, to improve their service, to improve their ambiance, and to keep their costs down. Same thing with a hardware store. If there's one hardware store, that's fine. Another one comes along. Could it take business away from the first? Yes, it could. But that would create incentive for both to improve their product and service and to keep their prices down. So I don't have any idea why we should limit entry into the casino market. All the people who spend so much time praising free markets, who I suspect will turn around and vote in favor of this bill, I think you have a little bit of intellectual inconsistency that you need to explain. I'm a no on this bill.
Thank you, Senator. Any other discussion on Senate Study Bill 1069 as amended? Senator Walz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Webster, would you yield?
Senator Webster, will you yield?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Senator. I'm, just curious, can you share with the body kind of your view on what the role of the Racing and Gaming Commission is if this passes into law? I mean, we have a commission that exists to evaluate, make these decisions. This bill would essentially be the legislature telling the commission to not do its job for 6 years. Like, what's the point of the commission if this passes into law?
I think the point is the second part of the bill, and I think it's a point that's very well taken in many situations, that we do have boards that are appointed by the governor in this particular case, and all over within government. We can go to the building code board. We can go to many other situations. I believe that they should have basic policies set by policy holders, policy handlers, which is the legislature in this particular case, basic rules in order to function in their position as having a board. I believe the second part of this bill is the part that sets out those particular ideas and those particular policies that they should have directive for. That's what I believe the Racing and Gaming Commission will function and how it will function in the future.
Thank you, Senator. I'll echo my colleague, Senator Cormack. I'm going to be a no today. look, we have a Racing and Gaming Commission specifically for the purpose of making these kinds of decisions. And what it seems like is this is the legislature putting its thumb on the scale and saying, we're going to tell you no new licenses for the next 6 years. And look, I fully expect we're going to be right back here in 2029 or 2020 or 2030 having a similar conversation. And so Mr. Chair, if this passes, we should have a conversation about ending the Racing and Gaming Commission, entirely. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Walls. Any other conversation or comments on Senate Study Bill 1069? Anybody else wish to speak to it? Seeing none, Senator Webster, you are in order for closing comments on Senate Study Bill 1069 as amended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I always take the beginning part to mention some of the questions that come up within a bill. And I don't say that at points in time in this conversation that free markets didn't come up, but saying that the casino market is a free market is equivalent to saying that the power industry within Iowa is a free market. It is heavily regulated, heavily regulated. We tell them exactly how they're going to act, how they're going to do, what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, all the time. It is not a free market as it sits. So looking forward as calling this an interruption of free markets when it's not a free market is interesting at the least. The idea that we have the Racing and Gaming Commission is a good idea. Senator Walls brought that up. But we need to give guidelines and guardrails for those particular commissions in order to make sure that they're following the policies set out by the legislature overall. We can't just give a quasi-board the availability to do anything and everything. Everybody talks about this particular bill being about a casino in Cedar Rapids. It's not. It's about casinos in Iowa overall. If one casino goes in, we could have 40 more tomorrow. It will be very hard to turn down casinos in the future without putting some sort of guardrails and expectations of policy, which we come here and we've been elected by 60-some thousand people to make policy for the state. This particular bill has given us an opportunity to make that policy, set some guardrails for that particular committee, and allow them in the future to follow those guardrails. And I think that is what we should do as policyholders or makers within the state. This is not just about one casino. One casino is on everybody's mind right now because it's out there. When we talk about that particular casino, that casino was going to be built where it's at. It got turned down twice. And in response, it got built 30 miles down the road, roughly. It's not very far to get there. We're talking about expanding casinos in Iowa in areas where there's been a lot of expansion. We've changed a lot of things. We've gone from boats that had to cruise to boats that could sit alongside the river to now land-based casinos. At one point in time, they had to be on a bladder of water. Now all of a sudden they can be anywhere and everywhere. If we think that one casino is the question on this bill, I think we are definitely wrong. This is about casinos throughout the state of Iowa. This is about setting guardrails and setting policy for how that casino expansion happens in our state before it just rapidly takes off at a pace out of anybody's control completely. You want to talk about putting the thumb on the scale? I guarantee you if 30 casinos start coming into the state of Iowa and everybody's community that's in here, the thumb will start getting put on the scale and it'll be wrong. We should do it before we get to expansion. That's why I think we need to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation quickly. We need to have this bill in some form move forward. With that said, I move Senate Study Bill 1069 as amended.
Senator Weiner, how would you like to vote?
Roll call, please.
Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Senator Webb.
Aye.
The bill passes, moves onto the calendar under Rule 40. With that, I will turn the chair back over to Senator Webster.
With no further business, moves we adjourn. Yes. Who's it go to then? My clerk?